Is this still a normal day at the office?
What does that mean exactly? You think that's what he's trying to do? Why are we learning this now?
Is that weird? Why is this happening? Why is that? Why is that? Why is that? Buckle up, stay with us. Pop quiz. Ready? American history pop quiz. Who was the head of the Republican Party at the height of the Watergate crisis? Who was the head of the Republican Party when Nixon resigned? Poppy Bush. George H.W. Bush was the chairman of the Republican National Committee from early 1973 until just after Nixon resigned in the fall of 1974. And when he was head of the Republican Party, in the summer of '73, right after White House counsel John Dean started testifying about Nixon before the Senate Watergate Committee, right after Dean had started basically spilling the beans on not only the crime, but the cover-up and the Nixon enemies list and all the rest of it, that summer, July 1973, Republican National Committee Chairman George Bush set out on a listening tour. He traveled to 4 states to assess the mood of the Republican Party when it came to Watergate. How were the party faithful feeling about Watergate? How was the party coping? How was this playing outside Washington? We know that he did this, and we know what the results of that listening tour were because George Bush wrote this memo about it. Date July 2nd, 1973, memorandum to General Alexander Haig. Haig was White House Chief of Staff, right? From George Bush, you see the initials there next to it, GB. Dear Al, I prepared the attached mood of the party memo for the president. Then he gives the bottom line, quote, we're in fair shape. I expect when we get by those witnesses dragged in by Dean, we'll be doing okay. All best. And then, indeed, there is this 2-page memo that is attached. And the 2-page memo is addressed to both General Haig, the Chief of Staff, and to President Nixon himself. It's listed as confidential, but no action required. Here's what Poppy Bush says. Quote, I have just returned from a 4-state visit, see attached schedule, to show types of events. With the exception of a meeting with students at the University of Washington, the other meetings were party and press meetings. The press questions, he said, were 95% about Watergate. And it wasn't just the press with that fixation. Quote, Poppy Bush says, the party people ask me almost exclusively about Watergate. But he then goes on to describe his overall findings on his listening tour. Quote, I would summarize the mood as follows. A, the press. He describes them as skeptical. And here, keep in mind, he's talking about the press that he has encountered on this 4-state listening tour outside the Beltway in these 4 states to which he has traveled. He says the press out there in the country is, quote, more civil than Washington, D.C. and New York press conferences. For the most part, willing to entertain the thesis that party is not the loser out of the scandal, meaning that the Republican Party as a whole is not being tarnished too much by the Watergate scandal. B, George Bush then assesses the mood of the students with whom he met. Quote, unwilling to accept at all my conviction that president is uninvolved in Watergate. Quote, reasonable acceptance of the thesis that party should not suffer because of Watergate. Civil in attitude, good questions. And then finally, he gives his assessment of the mood of the party people. So this is the chairman of the Republican Party at the time, 1973, talking about the base, talking about how the Republican Party faithful out there in the country, how they're feeling about this Washington scandal, this Watergate scandal, as John Dean is testifying and as the scandal is really starting to consume official Washington. According to George Bush, Republican Party chairman, the summer of '73, in his assessment, the party people, quote, the party people have a, quote, almost unanimous desire to believe that the president is telling the truth. Abhorrence of enemies list, the enemies list that John Dean had testified about, quote, immense frustration about CRP, that's the Committee to Re-elect the President, better known now as CREEP. He says, quote, all that money sitting there and its continued existence. Remember, this memo was written in the summer of 1973, after the '72 election. So Nixon had already been reelected at this point. He's saying the party faithful are frustrated that the Committee to Re-elect the President still exists with all that money sitting in it, especially if it's going to turn out to be a slush fund related to the Watergate scandal. According to Poppy Bush, the party people, quote, also feel the press is playing up Watergate too much. He says the party people have, quote, unanimous distrust of John Dean, but some uncertainty as to his testimony. The party people, quote, generally want the president to hold a press conference or speak out. They generally do not feel the president should appear before the Senate committee. And then he gives his summary. Quote, so this is George Bush, then head of the Republican Party, right? Explaining he's got this personal conviction that the president was uninvolved in Watergate, even if people don't believe him about that. Here was his conclusion for President Nixon and the White House Chief of Staff that summer in this confidential memo. Quote, the party people need shoring up. They want to believe in the president. They are hurt and embarrassed by Watergate. They feel betrayed by Watergate. But when told, we will overcome, based on the president's record and party's principles, they react enthusiastically. The party people need shoring up. Tonight, after another difficult day in his own summer of escalating scandal, the current president of the United States definitely set out to shore up the party people. Tonight, the president is in Indiana holding what the White House described as a Make America Great Again rally, promoting support for a Republican candidate who's trying to unseat Democratic Senator Joe Donnelly in Indiana. Much like President Nixon in the summer of 1973, the whole country knows, and the Republican Party itself knows, that a crucial factor in how this is all going to work out for the president and for the party is the level of support and enthusiasm and trust that the president continues to inspire from the Republican base, from the party people, right, who George Bush set out to survey in the summer 45 years ago. And both with Nixon 45 years ago and with President Trump tonight, everybody looking at this presidential scandal in a clear-eyed way knows that there's a connection between the amount of support the president can continue to count on from the party faithful. There's a connection between that and the extent of his own legal jeopardy. Yes, the president appears sort of proverbially bulletproof in terms of whether or not this scandal will dent his standing with the members of the Republican base who love him the most. But everybody knows from American history, even from the history of this president, that you can only take so much before even the party faithful start to wither a little bit in their support and confidence and trust in the president. And that may end up being absolutely crucial as to his ultimate fate and to what happens to the fate of the president and his party together. Right? And the president's legal jeopardy, the extent of the president's legal troubles, the extent to which he was drawn into the scandal personally, in 1973, that wasn't yet clear for Nixon either, right? John Dean was just starting his testimony. The Republican Party chairman was still telling everybody he was absolutely convinced that Nixon had no personal involvement in the crime or the cover-up, which he absolutely did. There's that level of uncertainty today as well about how much the president is going to be personally implicated in the scandals that continue to surround him. Today, the New York Times broke yet another story about this president's apparent personal involvement in the scandal that has started ensnaring his campaign aides and his business associates, including those who are now flipping against him, a la John Dean. The president's personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, pled guilty last week to 8 federal felony charges, and in so doing, in open court, under oath, the president's personal lawyer implicated the president himself in 2 of the felonies to which Mr. Cohen pled guilty, both of which were campaign finance charges. Both of those felonies involved a tabloid company called American Media and its flagship publication, the National Enquirer. Well, today, the New York Times reports that the president and Michael Cohen, beyond the 2 hush money payments already implicated in Cohen's felony pleadings, Times reports that Cohen and Trump also made an effort to buy up all of the dirt and information that the National Enquirer and its parent company had stockpiled on Donald Trump as a public figure, dating all the way back to the 1980s. You might remember that last week, the Associated Press reported that the American media actually kept a physical safe, a vault, in which everybody knew they safeguarded all their sensitive information about celebrities and public figures that they had obtained but not yet published, including information about Donald Trump. Well, today's revelation from the New York Times is essentially that the president at least tried, during the campaign, to buy the contents of that safe. Again, 2 hush money payments related to that company and paid out during the campaign have already resulted in felony charges for the president's personal lawyer, felony charges in which the president himself has been named as a co-conspirator. Right? The president's lawyer has said under oath that the person who directed the commission of those felonies was the president. The president's business is also apparently implicated in the commission of those felonies, according to the criminal information filed in court alongside Michael Cohen's guilty plea. If that part of this alleged criminal enterprise involving the president now also turns out to involve a greatly expanded universe of derogatory information about the president that the campaign may have been trafficking in or trying to buy for the purpose of influencing the election, well, who knows where that is going to go? But when things came to an end in the Watergate scandal, it was because of a Supreme Court ruling. A unanimous ruling from the United States Supreme Court, which ordered the president to comply with a court-ordered subpoena to turn over the White House tapes. That's what resulted in the public release of those White House tapes. It was the public release of those tapes which really broke the dam in terms of Republican support for Nixon. Realizing that he would likely be impeached and removed from office, including by many votes from members of his own party in Congress, President Nixon then resigned. That case at the Supreme Court that led to that outcome is legendary because it had such profound consequences. But as a matter of law, that Supreme Court ruling is not seen as controversial, right? It was a unanimous ruling, for one, including from judges who'd been appointed by President Nixon. Since Watergate, that ruling has come to be seen as a bedrock part of modern jurisprudence that proves that in America, even U.S. presidents can't break the law or defy the law with impunity. There's a lot of Supreme Court rulings that are very well known because they're the source of controversy. U.S. v. Nixon is very well known, but it's not because it's the source of controversy. It's not a controversial ruling. That said, President Trump's Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanaugh, has, very unusually, suggested publicly that, quote, maybe U.S. v. Nixon was wrongly decided. And now today, Democrats in the Senate have announced that one of the witnesses they will call to testify next week at the confirmation hearings for Brett Kavanaugh will be Richard Nixon's old White House counsel, John Dean, who came clean with the Senate Watergate Committee and told them all about the crime and all about the cover-up, and that ultimately resulted in the dominoes starting to fall that resulted in the end of that presidency. John Dean's going to testify against Brett Kavanaugh. Specifically, we expect on the issue of executive power and Kavanaugh deriding the result of U.S. versus Nixon. I mean, if this White House right now is at all trying to swim its way out of the comparison of this president's scandals and Watergate, and indeed the unfavorable comparison of this White House to the Nixon White House in the Watergate era, it turns out they're swimming against very, very strong, very fast historical currents here. So we're gonna have more coverage on that tonight, including we'll have an interview tonight with the reporter who first broke the news about the National Enquirer and its safe full of compromising information, including on the president. But I also want to give you an update tonight on a story that was strange when we talked about it on last night's show for the first time. It is a story that has since gotten a good deal stranger today. As you know, one of the main determinants of what's going to happen next in American political history and with this presidency is the fate of the U.S. Congress, and what's going to happen with the midterm elections that are now just a couple of months away, 68 days away to be exact. It will be a seriously uphill battle for them to do so, but the Democratic Party is putting absolutely everything it's got into an effort to try to take back control of the House of Representatives. In order to do that, they're going to need to take a couple of dozen seats that are currently held by Republicans. They'll need to flip those seats Democratic. And every competitive district is different all around the country, right? Every state, every locality has its own issues, its own personalities, its own dynamics to contend with. So there's all sorts of different approaches, as many different approaches as there are different congressional districts at stake this fall in terms of how Democrats are approaching trying to win individual seats and thereby contribute to flipping the House. But there is a theme that you can see even from a distance in the Democratic effort. And whether it was a deliberate effort on the Democratic Party's part or not, it so happens that there are a ton of Democrats running this year, trying to flip competitive seats. who are Democrats with military backgrounds, intelligence backgrounds, law enforcement backgrounds. There's just a ton of Democratic congressional candidates this year in lots of crucial districts where the Democratic candidate has national security qualifications on his or her resume. We know that in part because the Democratic Party is keeping a list of those types of candidates. Scrolling by here, this is the list of Democratic congressional candidates this year by name and by the state and congressional district in which they're running, that formed the distribution list to which the Democratic Party sent a letter this week warning all these Democratic candidates that because of their national security background, because they may have qualified for security clearances either currently or in the past, they should be on the lookout for potentially being doxxed by the Republican Party or by the Trump administration. This is that letter from the Democratic Party to these candidates, which I referenced the existence of last night. We've now obtained the letter. Quote, "Dear friends and future colleagues, it has come to our attention that the Congressional Leadership Fund, a super PAC with connections to House Speaker Paul Ryan, has somehow obtained and is distributing an unredacted questionnaire for national security positions, an SF-86 form, from one of our candidates, Abigail Spanberger, a former CIA officer and law enforcement agent. Quote, we are unaware of any way that this unredacted form could have been obtained legally. As an individual who has served our federal government either in the military or in a national security capacity, you likely know that an SF-86 is the most comprehensive document anyone seeking a security clearance with the federal government must complete. In this case, the document the Paul Ryan super PAC circulated was not redacted and contained sensitive private information, including the candidate's social security number and full medical history. I write you today in the likelihood that you also filled out an SF-86 in your service to our country, and to warn you of this super PAC's disturbing behavior in this case." And the letter goes on for a while. It concludes with a warning to these Democratic candidates who have national security backgrounds that they need to be particularly vigilant about their security. It reminds these candidates that they can avail themselves of a senior team specifically dedicated to cybersecurity from the Democratic Party if these candidates feel like they have need of it. So here's the Democratic Party, couple months out from the election, saying to all its candidates who have national security background, hey, watch out, new threat that applies specifically to you. It's a remarkable story. We first learned that this candidate, Abigail Spanberger's security clearance application, had been obtained by a Republican opposition research group and then by Paul Ryan's PAC, thanks to this New York Times article, which broke late on Tuesday night. Abigail Spanberger was a CIA case officer for years, working primarily on counterterrorism issues. Before her CIA career, she also worked as a federal agent on the law enforcement side of the U.S. Postal Service. What has been clear from the beginning of this scandal since it first broke is that Abigail Spanberger's security clearance application really has been circulated by this Paul Ryan super PAC. And they really have been using it against her in her congressional campaign, despite the fact that it's not legal for them to have it. What has not been clear until today is how they got it in the first place. Candidate Abigail Spanberger herself wrote to the Paul Ryan group a couple of days ago and put it in blunt terms. Quote, "It has come to my attention that the Congressional Leadership Fund, this PAC, has somehow obtained a full unredacted copy of at least one of my SF-86 documents and has disseminated this document for political purposes. In fact, I have clear evidence that your group has provided this to at least one news outlet. I'm not aware of any legal way that your group could have this document." Well, that concern was echoed today in a new letter signed by over 200 national security personnel, people with experience at the CIA and the Military and National Security Council and elsewhere. They released this letter today to the Director of Office of Personnel Management and to the Director of National Intelligence. It says, quote, "Neither we nor national security law experts we've consulted are familiar with any previous case of an SF-86 being released in full to include social security number and medical history. We've yet to hear an adequate explanation as to why Ms. Spanberger's sensitive personal information was released and subsequently made public by Paul Ryan's Political Action Committee." Quote, "Each year, thousands of aspiring public servants file this same document hoping to serve their country just as we did. They must be confident that their information will be handled securely and never released pursuant to a political agenda." Well, her security clearance application is being used now for a political agenda against her. We still don't know why this incredibly sensitive document was released to a Republican Oppo research firm. As noted, it is, as far as we can tell, a totally unprecedented breach. As of today, though, we do know how that Oppo research firm and then Paul Ryan's PAC did obtain it. The U.S. Postal Service put out a statement today admitting that they did it. They said it was an accident. They're apologizing for it. Quote, "The Postal Service deeply regrets our mistake in inappropriately releasing Ms. Spanberger's official personnel file to a third party, which occurred because of human error. We take full responsibility for this unfortunate error, and we have taken immediate steps to ensure this will not happen again. The Postal Office intends to change our process for handling requests for personnel file information to provide further protection against its inadvertent release and to ensure that such requests are properly handled in the future. Quote, "We are continuing our review," get this, "but we believe the issue began in June 2018 and that only a small number of additional requests for information from personnel files were improperly processed." Oh, there's more? So, security clearance applications are among the most sensitive personal documents that the government safeguards about federal officials. They are not subject to Freedom of Information Act requests, particularly from Oppo research firms who want to use them against people who are running for office. But in this case, the U.S. Postal Service, for some reason, handed over this candidate's full unredacted file in response to a FOIA request from this Republican Oppo research group. Postal Service now says they're very sorry, but oh, by the way, it wasn't just her. A small number of additional requests for information from personnel files were improperly processed. Beyond this one, others were improperly processed. Paul Ryan's super PAC is not just active in the field against this one congressional candidate, Abigail Spanberger, who's running to try to replace Dave Bratt in Virginia. Paul Ryan's PAC is operating all over the country, trying to pick off Democrats who pose a threat to Republican-held seats. Well, how many more requests like this did they make against how many other Democratic candidates with national security backgrounds? The agency that did this thus far is not saying how many other people they did this to. So it definitely happened to Spanberger, but who else did it happen to as well? From the Daily Beast today, quote, "The agency is not answering follow-up questions about how many federal officials had their personnel files processed and whether those files were released and to whom." So we don't know who else this happened to. But even in just this one instance that we know about, we're also confronted with the fact that the Republicans here, this super PAC controlled by the House Speaker, Paul Ryan, they obtained this document they never should have obtained, let alone circulated. They circulated it. They're apparently completely unrepentant about that. Their justification for using this document to try to hurt Spanberger's candidacy is that it was maybe sent to them mistakenly, but it was sent to them, so too bad. I mean, this is like if you went to the ATM, you popped in your ATM card, you withdrew $20 from your account, and after you got your $20 out of your account, the ATM started beeping crazily and just spit you out $20,000, all from somebody else's account. Right? Do you just expect to be able to put that in your pocket and walk off? Score. I asked for it fair and square. What I get, I didn't, well, it's mine now. I mean, in this case, we're not talking about money. We're talking about sensitive national security information. But it does seem astonishing that apparently the plan is that they're just going to keep using it. Keep using it. Why not? Who's going to stop them? Joining us now is Abigail Spanberger, Democratic nominee for Virginia's 7th Congressional District, running to try to unseat Republican Congressman Dave Bratt. Ms. Spanberger, thank you very much for being here tonight. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me on, Rachel.
So we've seen this story unfold over just a quick few days. What do you think of the current explanation that we've got now that the release of this very sensitive document from your time applying as a federal law enforcement officer and a CIA officer, it was all released just as an accident?
Well, that is the explanation that they've given. And frankly, it doesn't remove or change the fact that my document was released in violation of the Privacy Act and that it was given to this research firm and that it was later then circulated and provided to journalists. So, I'm incredibly disappointed that this human error, which resulted in a violation of the law, so profoundly impacted me. But actually, I am really glad that it came to light because I want to ensure that this doesn't happen to other people in the future.
As far as you know, in terms of the response that we've had from the administration thus far, Have they notified any of the other people who may have been subject to the same kind of breach? They made reference today in their formal statement about this matter that there may be other people whose personnel files, with who knows what's in them, may have also been breached. Do we know if they've made further contact with other people who might have suffered what you did?
I do not know that, no.
Okay. I also want to ask you about a matter of timing here. So the conservative PAC here, these Republican groups that obtain this information, they apparently got this paperwork by accident through a Freedom of Information Act request that should not have been responded to the way it was. As far as I understand it from the New York Times reporting, a firm hired by you to help essentially prepare for your own campaign also filed a Freedom of Information Act request for your own records months and months ago at the end of last year. And as far as I'm told, the firm working for you that filed that same request for your information still hasn't gotten anything. But this Republican group appears to have had a zip, very quick, less than a month turnaround in terms of how quickly they got their information.
That's correct. It's typical for campaigns to file research requests for themselves. So we hired a firm to research me, and they did submit Freedom of Information Act requests back in December of 2017. And as of right now, we have not received any information either from CIA or from the U.S. Postal Service related to my time as a federal agent or as a case officer with the CIA.
So you asked for this information on yourself. You're waiting 9 months now and you still haven't gotten anything. We know from the timing, as explained by these Republican groups, that they got a response, including your unredacted security clearance application. They had it in hand within 3 weeks of them first making a request. That timing seems nuts. I don't know if you have any explanation or any suspicions about that.
I don't have an explanation for it. I would echo your sentiments. You know, and as you noted in the opening, a FOIA request wouldn't typically or wouldn't result in receiving an SF-86, which is the National Security Questionnaire, and certainly not an unredacted one, which, as you mentioned, include my full medical history, my social security number, you know, every place I've ever lived, every roommate I've ever had, basically all of the information that you entrust to the federal government when you ask that in exchange they provide you with a security clearance and entrust you with state secrets.
Last question for you here. You are part of what appears to be a real wave of Democratic candidates running this year, particularly first-time candidates who do have a national security background, people with law enforcement, military, intelligence, diplomatic, foreign service background. I wonder if you think that's a coincidence or if there's something about our politics in this moment, this year, at this time, with Democrats' opportunities, that effort to take back the House, which would really change Washington fundamentally, I think, right now. Is it a coincidence there's so many people with the kinds of backgrounds that you have that are all running right now? Or do you think it's sort of, do you think it's a moment for the Democratic Party right now that we should see as a national trend?
I think it is a national trend. And when you look at the fact that we did have a super PAC that was pushing out my personal information, my security, my social security number, my medical information, you know, in attempts to have some sort of political gain, it speaks to how broken our system is. It speaks to what is wrong with our political system. And I think there are so many of us who have served in various ways as in the military and the intelligence community and law enforcement who were driven to serve the mission of protecting this country and upholding the Constitution. And this situation is just emblematic of how bad things are in politics. And, you know, you expect to be hit with a couple of attack ads here or there, I suppose. But this is just beyond the pale. And what it does and what it signals to anyone who might currently be in federal service, who's filled out an SF-86, a national security questionnaire, you know, I think there's probably people around the country taking pause of what might happen with the information they thought was safe. Mm-hmm. And so many of us who are running, we're running because we want to stand up for what's right and we want to get this country back on track and be part of the change of changing not just the tone of the conversation in Washington, but really standing up for the principles of just right and wrong. And the fact that this information was put out in violation of law, either by a human error or otherwise, you know, that was the first mistake. But then the second mistake is that an organization would know that they received this in error in violation of the law and would continue to push it out. And so, you know, for those of us who are running, we're running because we want to stand up for what's right and bring our voices to Congress. And I'm excited to be part of this wave because I think this is just one more example of the fact that people with a service to focus on service to country and mission of upholding the Constitution, that's exactly what we need in Washington at this time.
Abigail Spanberger, former CIA officer, Democrat running for Congress in Virginia, 7th District. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. I'm sorry this has happened to you, but thank you for allowing it to come to light so we can at least put our radar up about the possibility it may happen to others as well. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Right.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. Stay with us.
The topics we cover on MSNBC every day, they're driven by big ideas, big themes, huge societal changes. And that's what we talk about on our new podcast. It's called Why Is This Happening?
Why Is This Happening with Chris Hayes. New episodes every Tuesday. The full video podcast is no longer available, but The Rachel Maddow Show still is. Check out the full episode audio podcast or watch the show online anytime at now.msnbc.com.